This is not an escape from an apocalyptic scenario. This is a wave of shortages from Moscow to St. Petersburg, from Samara to Nizhny Novgorod. These trucks and vehicles can no longer get enough fuel. With daily fuel limits, they cannot even travel from Moscow to St. Petersburg with their cargo. However, this level of shortage is only the visible part of a much more dire situation. Imagine there is not enough fuel, and what if there are not enough trucks and vehicles to transport it? These are the Russian KamAZ trucks filling the roads, the Lada cars that are every family's dream, the Rostselmash combine harvesters plowing through the country's vast 11-time zone geography. These were once the steel symbols of Russia's industrial power, its self-sufficiency myth, and its global market ambitions. But now, with the fuel crisis, they are symbols of a new and more dire shortage. Because while kilometer-long lines of trucks and cars clog the roads, a new wave of internal rebellion is brewing within these factories, within Russian industry. And this is paralyzing land bridges across Russia's vast geography, from Moscow to St. Petersburg, from Siberia to Krasnodar. The main reasons for this situation were hidden in the massive crisis experienced by the Russian automotive and industrial sectors, created by the Kremlin. These empty production lines you see, corridors where the hum of machines has been replaced by a deadly silence, and factory gates with locks rusting over them are not the result of Ukrainian missiles or Western sabotage. This is a snapshot of a self-destruction operation deliberately carried out by the Kremlin itself. The scarcity now crippling even Russia's major cities is hidden not only in the difficulty of sourcing parts or the fuel crisis, but also in the resignation and silent rebellion of thousands of workers turning against Putin. Starting in 2024, with Russia entering a serious war economy crisis, a system of poverty and modern slavery, designed and legalized by the Kremlin itself, has emerged. For the Kremlin, laying off hundreds of thousands, even millions, of skilled industrial workers at once would have shattered those record-low unemployment statistics. It would also have created a massive social shock capable of triggering mass worker protests and a revolutionary uprising, the greatest nightmare for Russian leaders since 1917. But this fear was about to become reality, because in the current climate of repression, these millions of industrial workers, who had been the Putin regime's most loyal and silent supporters, were now signaling that they would no longer remain silent. In the icy silence of the factories, at the head of idle assembly lines, a much more dangerous, much deeper fire was burning in the eyes of a father who had lost 90% of his salary. This helplessness was now giving way to silent anger, to the rumble of rebellion. So how did millions of industrial workers, the most loyal supporters of the Putin regime, dare to turn against Putin and the regime? To see this, we first need to look at the hidden lines in one of the Kremlin's darkest and most deceptive propaganda masterpieces, a massive national deception, the employment protection lie. On paper, everything looks perfect. Rosstat, the Russian Federal Statistics Service, proudly announces every month that the country's unemployment rate is at its lowest level in history, falling below even 3%. These figures are presented on propaganda channels compared to economic crises in the West as proof of how wise a leader Putin is. However, these figures are nothing more than a curtain designed to hide the truth. What is actually happening is the fuse of an internal rebellion that could trigger a civil war. What actually happened was not an employment protection program. It was a legalized poverty mechanism that legally impoverished millions of people, stripped them of their social rights and futures, and created a hidden army of unemployed. The official name of this deception, shortened work week, or mandatory unpaid leave. The system operates with diabolical simplicity. When giant factories like KamAZ, AutoVAZ, and Kirov could no longer produce due to Western sanctions, shortages of imported parts, and the complete diversion of state resources to the defense industry, they did not officially lay off their workers. Because laying off hundreds of thousands of workers at once would both undermine those record-low unemployment statistics and create a massive social shock capable of triggering mass protests. Instead, workers are transitioned to a shortened work week. Those bustling days of working 5 days, 3 shifts, are now a distant memory. Now they are called to work only 1 or 2 days a week, and even then, only for a few hours. Or worse, they are sent on indefinite mandatory unpaid leave. In this case, they are forced to sit at home and wait, not knowing when the factory will call them back. Despite all this, since no action such as layoffs is being taken, a different picture exists on paper. On paper, the worker is still an employee of the factory. They are not included in unemployment figures. They continue to feature in the Kremlin's statistics as a success story. But in reality, they have lost 80%, sometimes even 90% of their salary. They can no longer support their family or pay their bills. Their social security is effectively suspended. Worst of all, they cannot look for a new job. Because they are still officially employed, applying for another job means losing their rights, such as severance pay from their current job. This is a modern system of slavery. Thousands of workers at the Kirov Factory, tens of thousands of employees at AutoVAZ's massive complex in Tolyatti, those sweating on the production lines at KamAZ in Naberezhnya Chelny. They are all caught in this trap. They are the invisible victims of Putin's war economy. They are not being killed by bullets like soldiers on the front lines, but slowly left to die in poverty. This situation is not limited to just a few large factories. This crisis has spread like cancer throughout the entire civilian industry. The Kirov Factory in St. Petersburg, one of the country's largest industrial centers, sent hundreds of workers on summer vacation and switched 900 employees to a reduced work week starting in August. In fact, a significant portion of the workers were voluntarily resigning because they couldn't survive under the current conditions. Factory management admits that production has fallen by 20 to 25%. This rate is not only a technical problem for an industrial facility, but also a social alarm. Similarly, Russia's leading agricultural machinery manufacturer Rostselmash has also hit the same bottleneck. After layoffs and resignations, Rostselmash is reeling from a drop in sales of up to 60%. Due to the war, farmers can neither find the money to buy new tractors nor the security to obtain loans from banks. State agricultural subsidies have also evaporated in the war budget. Rostselmash has also brought its production to a virtual standstill by putting thousands of its workers on the same reduced working hours system. Russia's truck giant KamAZ is also on the verge of a similar collapse. A nearly 60% drop in sales of trucks over 14 tons has forced the company into a difficult decision. KamAZ announced that it will switch some of its departments to a reduced work schedule. This situation means a chain reaction of contraction, especially for the transportation and logistics sector. Trucks not being produced means cargo that cannot be transported and industrial areas that cannot be reached. Even AutoVAZ, presented as Putin's darling, is unable to survive despite state support and the empty market advantage resulting from the withdrawal of Western car brands. At the end of September, the company switched to a 4-day work week. The company sold 211,300 Lada vehicles between January and September 2025, a performance that represents a nearly 25% decline compared to the same period the previous year. The Kremlin's national car pride is now turning into piles of metal gathering dust at dealerships. The collapse in the industrial sector is not limited to the automotive industry. The Chelyabinsk Electrometallurgical Combine, a giant metallurgical facility that accounts for 80% of the country's ferroalloy production, switched 1,200 employees to a 4-day work system starting September 1st. The slowdown on production lines is also directly affecting the construction, railway, and defense industries across the country. The Yaroslavl motor plant and the Yaroslavl diesel equipment plant are repeating the same scenario in the country's northern industrial belt. A shortened work week, reduced production plans, and increasing pressure on worker morale. Despite their strategic position in both military and civilian motor systems, these two plants are unable to operate at full capacity. One example that lays bare the gravity of the situation is the Tikhvin automobile plant. This facility, which employs approximately 7,000 workers, announced that it would switch to a 4-day work week until the end of November. However, it was not just working hours that were targeted here, but also the welfare of the workers. Wages were cut by 20% and all social benefits and bonuses were suspended. In other words, not only did the machines slow down, kitchens also cooled down and children's shoes were put on hold. This is not an isolated crisis affecting just a few factories. This is a ruthless process of destruction in which the war machine systematically devours the civilian economy in order to survive. Each step triggers the next, feeding a spiral of collapse that engulfs all of Russia. It all began with the ruthless diversion of money from the state budget and all resources in the economy to the defense industry. While defense spending constituted a significant portion of the federal budget before the war, it now exceeds 1/3, even according to official figures. Unofficial estimates suggest that, including secret funds, this figure approaches half of the budget. This is not just a budgetary choice, it is economic cannibalism. Tank factories, missile manufacturers, and ammunition plants receive unlimited orders and resources from the state, while the rest of the civilian industry has been left to die. Funds allocated for schools, hospitals, roads, and most importantly, civilian factories, the economic engine of the country, have evaporated. The war has turned into a black hole that swallows all resources. Civilian factories deprived of resources faced a series of fatal blows. Automotive giants like AutoVAZ can no longer import basic safety components such as modern engines, transmissions, electronic control units, and even airbags due to Western sanctions. The result was the production of sanctioned cars that technologically regressed decades, lacking even ABS braking systems. However, there was no one left to buy even these primitive cars. The economic uncertainty created by the war, record high interest rates, and the collapse of people's purchasing power slashed domestic demand. Car sales fell by 60%, and in some segments by as much as 75%. The same scenario played out in the agricultural machinery sector. Rostselmash may have the technology to produce modern combine harvesters, but there are no farmers left to buy these machines. Civilian industry is facing total suffocation. When demand collapsed and resources ran out, production lines inevitably stopped. Giants like KamAZ, AutoVAZ, and Rostselmash fell silent in their huge halls, once the size of cities, where tens of thousands of workers used to labor. This situation meant a death sentence for hundreds of Russian cities known as monogorod, where the entire economic life depended on a single factory. When AutoVAZ stopped in Tolyatti, not only the factory but the entire city came to a standstill. Restaurants, shops, the service sector. All were left with a customer base consisting of factory workers who could no longer be paid. These cities are slowly turning into modern ghost towns, places where despair and helplessness reign, social services collapse, and crime rates rise. The halting of production lines is not just an economic event, but also a social collapse. And this is the final and most dangerous link in the chain. Millions of skilled industrial workers, engineers, technicians, these people, once the backbone of the Russian middle class, are now being pushed to the brink of poverty by the loss of a significant portion of their income. Their belief in the Kremlin's promise of stability evaporates with every paycheck cut, every factory closed. These people formed one of Putin's most loyal voter bases. They had lived through the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse and saw the order brought by Putin as a blessing. Now, however, they feel they have been betrayed by the regime. Trust and loyalty are crumbling, and beneath this collapse, an uncontrollable anger, a silent rebellion, is rising. At this point, we must ask this critical question. Is this crisis a temporary lull that will end when the war is over? Or is it a harbinger of a much deeper, more permanent and strategic destruction? All the data shows that Russia is de-industrializing itself. This is the most painful proof that Putin has destroyed his country's long-term economic backbone, its future, and its prosperity for the sake of short-term military goals. There are several fundamental reasons for this irreversible destruction. The first is the loss of technology. Cut off from Western technology, machinery, and software due to sanctions, Russia's civilian industry is rapidly regressing to a primitive state. A country that produces cars without airbags today cannot compete in global markets tomorrow. This is not merely a regression, but a permanent disconnection from the global economic system. Second is brain drain and the loss of skilled labor. The most talented engineers, the most experienced technicians, and the brightest managers, condemned to poverty by the shortened work week, are either forced to join the army or seek ways to leave the country. This is a loss of human capital that will take decades to recover. You can rebuild a factory, but you cannot restore the accumulated knowledge and experience of the generations who will operate and develop that factory overnight. Third, and most importantly, is the complete distortion of strategic priorities. A country that cannot produce a tractor today cannot ensure its food security tomorrow. A country that cannot produce civilian trucks today cannot sustain its internal logistics and trade tomorrow. While Putin spends all resources on winning today's war, he leaves nothing behind to build tomorrow's Russia. Every new tank produced is actually built at the expense of 10 tractors that cannot be produced in the future. Every new missile launched is stolen from the budget of a hospital or school that cannot be opened in the future. This is not just an economic crisis, this is a choice of civilization. The Kremlin has completely abandoned the goal of building a modern, diverse, and globally integrated economy, choosing instead to transform the entire country into a massive, single-function weapons factory. However, it is clear that this model is unsustainable. The war cannot last forever, and when the war ends, Russia will be left with nothing but rusted tanks and missiles. It will have no civilian industry to produce, no skilled workers to run that industry, and no middle class to buy its products. This will be Putin's most painful and lasting legacy to Russia, a hollowed-out, de-industrialized country whose future has been stolen. Vladimir Putin had an implicit agreement with the Russian people, political freedom in exchange for economic stability. That agreement is now null and void. The promise of stability evaporated in the silent production lines of the KamAZ factory, in the cut wages of AutoVAZ workers, and in Rostselmash's unsold tractors. The Kremlin is unwittingly preparing its own demise. While its armies fight on the front lines, it is creating a mass of millions of angry, impoverished, and betrayed people at home. This mass is the real threat that Putin should fear more than Ukrainian missiles or NATO tanks. Because this mass, once the regime's most loyal supporters, is now turning into its greatest potential enemy. History shows that revolutions are usually started not by the most oppressed, but by those who once had a better life and then lost everything. Russia's industrial workers fit this description perfectly. They are the millions who believed the propaganda lies, trusted the Kremlin, and in return lost everything. The question now is when this social bomb will explode. And when that day comes, the voice of anger rising from Tolyatti, Naberezhny Chelny, and Kirov may be louder than all the artillery fire on the Ukrainian front. Putin sacrificed his own country to win the war, but in the process, he awakened the power that could overthrow his own regime, the silent rebellion of his people. So what do you think? Will this industrial collapse in Russia bring about the end of the Putin regime? And how will this situation affect the course of the war? Share your valuable opinions and analyses with us in the comments section. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like this video to support our independent analyses.